Okay, again, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Um, so I'm going to read Dr. Dixon's bio, and then, like I said, I will give him the floor. So has, Dr. Dixon is a native of Fort Valley, Georgia. In 1994, he received his BS in history with a minor in African American studies from Florida A&M University. In 2001, he received a Master's of Applied Social Science from Florida A&M University with a concentration in history. In 2001, he received a doctoral fellowship from Indiana University's History Department, where he majored in the African diaspora. His studies included African American history and African history with a minor in library science, specifically special collections and archives. In 2006, he became a visiting professor at Florida A&M University, as well as the head archivist and historian for the John G. Riley Museum. In the following year, 2007, he completed his dissertation entitled Black Seminole Involvement and Leadership During the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, and received a PhD in history from Indiana University. Dr. Dixon began his museum/public history work with the John G. Riley Museum in Tallahassee, Florida. From 2004 to 2007, he was the graduate archival intern. In 2007, he became the curator for the historic Virginia Key Beach Park in Miami, Florida. There, he assisted the rehabilitation and reopening. While in Miami, he created his consulting company, Archival and Historical Research Associates, LLC. Since that time, his company has consulted with various African-American museums/historic entities, including the B.B. King Museum in the Mississippi Delta and the Ritz Theater and Museum of Jacksonville, Florida. From 2009 to 2015, Dr. Dixon returned to Tallahassee to become the assistant director and field director of the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network. In this capacity, he assisted the growth and development of African American museums throughout the state. He provided archival training as well as assisted in program development. Dr. Dixon has also published 2 public history books, Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles, and the Second Seminole War, which was released in the spring of 2014. This work is a historical piece that examines the Black Seminole leadership and involvement in the Second Seminole War. Florida's Negro War also reexamines the war in the context of a slave rebellion. In the fall of the same year, Dr. Dixon published his 3rd book, Florida's African Diaspora Timeline. This book was created with the ideals of assisting in the infusion of Florida's Black history into the public educational system. Dr. Dixon feels that the more pride our young African Americans have in themselves, the more inclined they are to succeed. From 2015 to 2019, Dr. Dixon was a professor, curator, and archivist for Bethune-Cookman University. In these capacities, he has directed the process of revamping the university's archives, as well as the foundation/museum. During this period, he completed the Master's of Information Science degree at Florida State University.
From family members.
Hold on one second. Let me make sure everybody is muted.
I want to list.
Let me start over. From 2015 to 2019, Dr. Dixon was a professor, curator, and archivist for Bethune-Cookman University. In these capacities, he has directed the process of revamping the university's archives as well as the foundation/museum. During this period, he completed the Master's of Information Science degree at Florida State University. Also, he created a public history program, which includes a concentration and minor within the history division. Currently, he is the president of Archival and Historical Research Associates, a public history firm that specializes in archival and historical research. So, without further ado, we'll hand it over to Dr. Anthony Dixon. And again, Anthony, thank you so much.
Of course, anytime, sister, anytime. All right. While you were saying all those things, I thought about it, when we do African diaspora studies, we look at it in form of three specific ways, 3 specific things in a progressive manner. The first is to provide a voice to the voiceless and talk about those people, those stories, those cultural things that have been marginalized and unrecognized. And then the second is to make those cultural ties within the diaspora. And then the third is to use those that information in terms of looking at solutions for today's issue. And so that's really the three phases, or the three points we like to look at through the within the African diaspora lens. You know, providing a voice to the voiceless, making cultural connections, and then using that information to look at issues and help resolve issues that we're facing today. And so I want to use that same blueprint, so to speak, to talk tonight, and looking at the Saltwater Underground Railroad, the migratory patterns, the cultural connections, and what that actually means and where we are today in terms of what we want to do for the communities. And so I always like to begin at the beginning, which of course is the 1600s. Now, the roots are laid in Gullah culture. And when we do say Gullah culture, we mean a mixture of West African languages, West African culture. And that mixture is also indicative to how we are now also looking at the possibilities, the evidence that there were strong cultural connections and African people and indigenous people of African descent. And so we have basic evidence that goes even into the 1500s, where the Spanish are giving warnings to other seafarers and explorers to be mindful that it seems like the Africans are familiar with the land, that the Africans have some type of connection with the natives. We also have evidence of early Spanish records where they are describing Native Americans, particularly the Arwaks. They use the word swarthy, and we know that was a term for dark skin during that period of time. So we understand that Gullah people who have this mixture of West African languages and culture also seem to have some cultural connection to people that were here and considered natives, and that those natives obviously have some African heritage, and even some in those quote unquote indigenous may have been purely African themselves. We have one other piece of evidence, which happens again, and I'm just laying the groundwork here. When the Spanish tried to create their first settlement, which was Gueldape, present-day Sapelo Sound, Georgia, the Wally Native Americans, the Wally natives attacked the settlement. But the thing about it is that when they attacked the settlement, the enslaved Africans began to set fires to the settlement from within. So while the Wally were attacking from the outside, the enslaved Africans were setting fires and burning it down from the inside. And so that also brings up a very pertinent question as to how did these two groups understand and know simultaneously to work together. So that also provides some evidence of that relationship and that existence of Africans being here in the Americas, and for this case, for tonight's talk, specifically North America. Now, as we fast forward into the 1600s, the Gullah people began to, of course, incorporate plantation society, and they began to incorporate English words into their language that they created, which we call Geechee. And so what we recognize is by the mid 1600s, they are beginning to abscond and run away from the Carolinas and heading southward into La Florida. Now, when they do that, we understand that this actually begins the first Underground Railroad, and that it was done under their own volition. And it was done through them seeking out ways to escape plantation society, escape servitude. And so the destination point began to be the St. Johns River, which, of course, I don't know if most people know, but the St. Johns River is what we call one of the anomaly rivers. It is only one of the three rivers in the world that flows from south to north. The Amazon, of course, and the Nile rivers are the other two. Now, it began to be understood that once you reached the St. Johns River, which again, the most northern point is just above Jacksonville and right along the Georgia-Florida border. You have, of course, the smaller tributaries and creeks and things of that nature that flow on into South Georgia, particularly into an area we call, the area of Camden County or St. Mary's. And so this continued on until the 1680s, and this is where we see the first change. In the 1680s, specifically 1687, what happens is the Spanish conquistadors come across a group of Africans who absconded from the English colonies. And so they send word back to the crown in terms of what they should do with these Africans. Now, the thing about it is, at this particular point, Spain and England are at war. And Spain is also looking at how they can gain more control back over North America, because the English have now come in and they began to settle and they began to grow. And so they're looking at ways to slow down the growth and what they considered the encroachment of the English onto their lands. And so nothing takes place overnight. First, it has to go through, of course, the official channels. So the governor in Havana is notified first, and then the governor in Havana sends word to the crown. And so the official response doesn't come back until 1693. And it's known, of course, as the Edict of 1693, in which the king basically responds with, if any Africans abscond from the English colonies, specifically the Carolinas, that they can come into La Florida and they can live free. They can continue to eke out their own existence in these maroon villages. And so this at that point changes some of the dynamics in that we now have the first Underground Railroad truly becoming and developing into an established system. And so as time goes on, by the early 1700s, we have so many that are beginning to come in. Things between England and Spain are progressing in terms of this idea of who's encroaching upon whose land in North America, and the ideas that Spain always tried to set forth that they did own all of North America, and that the Pope had given them rights to North America. And of course, the English did not recognize the Pope's authority to do such. So as those things progressed, it actually aided the ability for the first Underground Railroad to continue to develop. And so what we find in the early 1700s, we see another change takes place. And so the Spanish crown makes another offer. And so that offer was that you can actually live in two different ways in La Florida. Excuse me. You can either continue to eke out your own existence in these villages, and at this point, we are definitely calling them the Florida Maroons. And then you could also come into St. Augustine and live under Spanish authority. And so a fort was actually built just outside of St. Augustine, to which we call Fort Mose. And it actually became the first line of defense. Now, we recognize that these are all still Gullah people through the through the cultural characteristics that we're recognizing in both the Maroon villages as well as in and at Fort Mose. Now, there has been early conjecture. I think we've kind of all come on the consensus now, but there was early conjecture whether or not the settlers that decided to go under Spanish authority at Fort Mose were indeed free or enslaved, because the conditions that they had to live in, or under rather, is a better word there. But the first thing was they had to accept Catholicism. And so we see Gullah culture in a certain aspect going into and accepting Catholicism. So we see at this point on this side of it, when I say this side, I mean those that go under Spanish authority, we see Gullah going into a diaspora. The other thing is that within that, the men had to be a part of the military. And that simply was indicative to what the Spanish government and authorities were doing in order to protect the settlement itself. There were Spanish men in St. Augustine either conscripted into the military, or they at least agreed to be a part of its overall defense. So the idea that restricted their freedom has now kind of gone away, so to speak, because that that we understand, even with the United States, right? We understand that that is basically something that the governmental process does in order to protect itself. I mean, even today, men 18 years old have to sign up with selective service. That doesn't mean they get pulled into the military, but they do have to sign up for the selective service. So those ideas that now circumvented their freedom have gone away. So we still see Fort Mose as a free settlement and a free society. It just undergoes those changes, like I mentioned earlier, with the imprint of Catholicism and Spanish culture, dealing specifically with the interactions with St. Augustine. And so now for those who continue to eke out their own existence, what we also find in the early 1700s is that as plantation society continues to grow in the Carolinas, and even further down, and I'll get to that in just a second, we have more and more Native Americans who are resisting plantation society, but they are also having to get and become rather part of the migratory patterns. And so as they become part of the migratory patterns that come down, looking for the St. Johns River and coming into La Florida, we start seeing the intermingling process in which they began to create villages next to these maroon villages or in close proximity to these maroon villages in order for protection and, of course, survival. And so when that process begins to take place, we see the Gullah going into another diasporic term there, where the language, the Geechee language, begins to incorporate Native American words. So what we're actually doing is we're watching the Gullah culture go into a diaspora, which ends up developing a completely new culture that is still rooted in these basic Gullah cultural characteristics. And so as time goes on in the 1700s, what we find is that between Spain and England, things have progressed, not just in Europe, but everything is now beginning to spill over into the Americas. Things are taking place in the Caribbean, things are taking place in North America. And so for our specific talk tonight and our concentrated talk, what we find is that there was a treaty in which they developed a quote unquote buffer zone. And that buffer zone was to create an area in which neither Spain nor England were supposed to encroach into that land. And so what we see is those who abscond now actually having a wider area of safety and a wider safe zone, because getting into that buffer zone was supposed to guarantee that that they would be able to eke out some existence even a little further north of the St. Johns River. However, the English began to ignore that treaty, and they come into the buffer zone and they began to create plantation and expand English plantation society into that buffer zone. And they began with the settlement of Savannah. And so, of course, that develops in time into the last 13th colony, which, of course, is Georgia. Now, what this does is it begins to change the migratory patterns of both the Native Americans as well as the Underground Railroad. By this time, and we're going now into the mid 1700s, by this time, the English are well advised about the migratory patterns and reaching the St. Johns River. Patrollers and the enslaved catchers are now onto those migratory patterns. They're able to go down, try to track people, which means they are also discovering those remote villages. And so what we see is a change in the migratory pattern, that they aren't coming necessarily straight down the coast headed toward the St. Johns River. As plantation society begins to develop in Georgia, and again, like I said, they're understanding, the English are understanding the migratory patterns, they began to change those patterns and go westward first, and then down into La Florida. And so as things began to pick up, we see two major changes again. The first is that the war again between Spain and England does begin to translate itself now into physical fighting in the Caribbean and in North America. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some skirmishes and things like that on the sea, particularly in the Caribbean, but now there is an effort. There's an all-out effort of Spain to stop England from encroaching into the buffer zone and ignoring treaties and things of that nature in the Americas. And so as a result, though, St. Augustine is attacked. When St. Augustine is attacked, Fort Mose is actually destroyed, and Fort Mose is burned down. And so when that happens, some of the residents go into the city of St. Augustine, and they live in the city of St. Augustine for a period of 12 years. And during that period, Fort Mose is being rebuilt. It takes them 12 years to rebuild Fort Mose. Now, there are, however, small numbers who actually relocate to Cuba, and so into Havana. And so that's the first inkling where we see Gullah people going further into the Caribbean. Now, again, this is not a large number. This is just the first inklings. Just like when Gueldape is burned down, and those Africans that helped set those fires to the first Spanish settlement, and they flee into the woods, those are our first inklings of the Maroons. It's not established, but it's the inklings. And so we see Gullah going into Havana and into Spanish culture in the Caribbean through the first attack on Fort Mose. And so, as we, again, on the second major thing that takes place is that they're having these problems and these schisms within the Native American peoples. One issue that we find on the East Coast is that when we get to the War of the Yamasee, and the Yamasee, which was a confederation of smaller bands of Native Americans, when this confederation goes into a war with England, we see a division there as well, in that the British or the English go into a formal agreement with the Wale, because they recognized that the Wale were, quote unquote, sworn enemies of the Spanish. And they recognized that the Wale had such a negative relationship with the Spanish, so they befriend the Wale. And so they actually get the Wale to join them in the war against the Yamasee. And so by the end of the Yamasee Wars, of course, they are now pushed further south, and they begin in much larger numbers to migrate into La Florida. And so again, we start seeing a stronger cultural mixture between the Yamasee, which is, again, this confederation of smaller Native American cultures and peoples. So again, we see Gullah developing more as a diaspora as they begin to intermingle with these different groups. And now I want you to keep in mind too, right? We still have those ideas that within those groups, there are strong African heritage within those groups. And so what we find is the development between those small groups and the development and the changes of the Gullah with this intermingling and this specific cohabitation process for safety and survival. Now, at the same time, out west, we have an issue going on with the Creek, who are in present-day Alabama, but they're right there on the line between Georgia and Alabama, and they're all the way down from the top of Alabama all the way down into what we call the corner, which is where present-day Georgia, Alabama, and Florida meet, of course, with the Florida Panhandle. What happens there is that they actually have internal problems, but the main internal problem is along the lines of enslavement, and that the lower Creeks are now beginning to accept plantation society, because again, you have to understand that Georgia, that English plantation society is now encroaching and developing in present-day Georgia, and is moving towards a settlement and a colony of its own. And so they have much more interaction with the English. And so as such, they begin to actually accept plantation society. And so this is one of the cornerstones to the schism between the upper Creeks and those that live in North Alabama and the lower Creeks. And so through this schism, the Upper Creeks began to migrate southward, and they pushed their way into La Florida, and they began to come in from the west, but they are in a migratory pattern going east. So you have the smaller bands and the Yamasee coming in from the east, migrating westward, and you have the Creeks coming in from the west, migrating eastward. And so by the mid 1700s, this homogenized group are not called Yamasee. They don't pick up any of the smaller names. They instead get the name by 1750, 1754. The English recognize them. We see them in the English writings as Seminole. Now, when we look at that word, though, it actually begins earlier with the Spanish word cimarron, and that meant wild or untamed beast. And they were actually referring to the Africans and the Gullah people. They were not referring to specific, quote unquote, what we would consider the quote unquote, even though it's a derogatory term at this point, the quote unquote red man or the lighter skinned Native American. But see, what that also does is it still brings up the ideas of Africans being a part of the Native American culture and the Native American group, an indigenous group already. So we look to do more research on that. But at this point, though, where we are is that we're looking at the fact that the Gullah people are now going through this major diasporic change. And so the intermingling with Native Americans, the intermingling with the Spanish, we now develop into different modes of what we would call the Florida Maroons, who are now developing and on their way to becoming Black Seminoles. And so Geechee itself is now going through this transformation into the Afro-Seminole Creole language. And so again, by the 1750s, and that also brings up another point. I've heard ideas about this strong relationship between the Spanish and the Blacks and the Florida Maroons, who develop into the Black Seminoles, and ultimately this relationship between Spain and Spanish people and Black Seminoles. But I want to kind of clarify that Spain was interested in keeping their possessions and dealing with England. That was their primary objective. The relationship that they developed with the Florida Maroons, with the Gullah people, with within the Afro-Seminole language, people who spoke that, within the people who were even at Fort Mose, that whole relationship was based on what they wanted to achieve in dealing with England. So some of the ideas of this strong relationship have been kind of over-romanticized. I've heard it from some Black Seminoles, and it's really been a little over-romanticized. And here are two key things. When Fort Mose first burns down, the first time they burned Fort Mose down, and as you recall, I said 12-year period. When those people went into St. Augustine, and they were in St. Augustine for those 12 years. We have evidence and records where the citizens, the Spanish citizens of St. Augustine, are writing to the governor and to Spanish authorities saying, hey, when are you going to hurry up and finish that fort so we can get these Negroes out of our city? And hey, we shouldn't keep letting these free Negroes walk around and intermingle with the Negroes that we have enslaved. That is a dangerous situation for us. So you have to understand that that Spain was not in this relationship in which they just truly supported the Florida Maroons and supported these people. They simply saw it as an advantageous point to slow down what the English were trying to do in the Americas. And even the term Cimarron, calling them wild and untamed, says a lot as well. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that those ideas where they kind of over romanticize the relationship between the Maroons and Black Seminoles and the Spanish. And so as we move forward into the 1700s, when we get to the 1760s, again, by 1754, we got Seminoles, homogenous group, renegades. They live in close proximity with these Florida Maroons. St. Augustine is attacked again. And when St. Augustine is attacked again, the Spanish are actually driven out. And the main way that they're driven out is that the English go into the Caribbean and they basically take and capture Havana. And they give the Spanish a choice. They say, you can give us La Florida and we'll give you Havana back, or we can keep Havana and you can keep La Florida. Well, that was an easy choice for the Spanish. They were still making most of their money in plantation society in the Caribbean. All of the silver and the gold that they were finding was going through a transportation process in which most of the administration of that gold and that silver was taking place in Havana. So it was an easy choice. So they give up Havana from basically 1763 to 1781, approximately. You know, that's the days that we said. Of course, some things took place a little earlier, but we put those as the official dates where the British and England now own, possess, and have control over La Florida. Now, for those that live at Fort Mose, when this happens, that community leaves when the Spanish leave and they relocate to Havana. And when they are in Havana, they create their own community. And so we see the Gullah with, of course, now Native American and Seminole culture being transferred into that as well, and developing. Is still not quote unquote officially Black Seminoles, but all of those cultural characteristics are already there. And so there is a community now at this point in time, in 1760s, being created, which is a Gullah community in its core. Now, what we find is that large numbers of Gullah people start coming into Florida, but they're coming in enslaved. And so what it does is it begins to signify the cultural differences in which the Maroons, who are now adapting and intermingling with Native Americans more, because they now have to rely on themselves for protection and for survival. And so what we find is that further development comes primarily in two ways. The first way is from the Native American side. From the Native American side, we start to see Florida Maroons being taught and advancing themselves in their survival skills in terms of hunting and things of that nature. And so the wrestling of alligators, bear fighting, things of that nature are part of the Native American culture that is now being taught and brought into the Florida Maroon Society. Now, on the Florida Maroon Society, they are teaching artisan skills like the basket weaving techniques, but they're also teaching Native Americans now how to grow crops within a specific land area. See, prior to that, Native Americans would grow crops. And when the land starts going bad, they didn't rotate crops. They simply picked up, went to another area where the food was more plentiful and the land was better, and they would live there for a while, and then they continue to migrate. And that actually was the basic problem between Native Americans, right, and the English, the idea of land use and property rights. And so now, though, now that plantation society was full and it was encroaching and it was circumventing their ability just to move around, it is the Gullah and the Florida Maroons who are now teaching them how to plant and grow and rotate crops instead of the regular way that they had lived by rotating fields. So it was a very symbiotic relationship there. And so as that relationship continues to grow through the 1700s, going into the late 1700s, you start developing a stronger bond, a stronger cultural existence. And so again, we see the ideas of the saltwater part, though, the saltwater migratory patterns, truly beginning with the burning of the Fort Mose that second time, and the permanent development of a Gullah community in Cuba. Now, again, we had the Inklings when it was destroyed the first time, but the second time we now, and the professor, friend of mine, Dr. Ralph Johnson, who was also on the Gullah Geechee Commission, was one of the leading researchers who uncovered the entire community and got markers and things of that nature in Cuba. Now, so what we see by the time we get to that period now, we're 1760s to 1780s, your Blacks are now dealing with Native Americans in a much stronger bond because they have them only themselves to rely on. They don't have the Spanish authority during this approximate 20-year period. We got plantation society that is now taking off in La Florida, particularly, not specifically, but particularly in the St. John's area, headed toward the Swanee River. Now, here's the problem with that, right? When they first began to develop into the buffer zone, that's when they first changed the migratory patterns. So now as plantation society is starting to head west toward the Swanee River, of course, they are about to run into and encroach upon those Native American and Florida Maroon villages who had gotten there about 40 years prior now. So on that note, what we find is that they divide Florida into an East and a West Florida. And in East Florida, plantation society is beginning to dominate. There are smaller numbers of maroon societies along the St. John's River and going westward and southward. And then in West Florida, it is highly populated with Native Americans, who they are referred to as Seminoles now, and these Blacks, these Florida Maroons. And then there, if you go even further west, you go all the way out the Panhandle, you then have Pensacola, which is still primarily dominated by Spanish culture and Spanish people who didn't leave. But make no mistake about it, the area around that, between present day Pensacola going back toward Tallahassee, is highly dominated by Native Americans and Florida Maroons. And so what we find then, of course, is another major schism, right? Gave the dates, right? 1763, 1781. But in that time, of course, we have the American Revolution. And so the American Revolution now changes the dynamics as well. And so the British are trying to hold on to La Florida, while, of course, they are losing the 13 colonies. And so Spain then takes advantage of that. They take full advantage of the American Revolution. And so Spain goes into the Caribbean and they capture Barbados. And they do the exact same thing to the Spanish do the exact same thing to the British that was done to them, which is they give them a choice. We can give you Barbados back, you give us La Florida back. And again, that was an easy choice. Barbados was their primary sugar plantation colony. They were making more money in Barbados than they were just in the St. Augustine area going westward in La Florida. So they gave La Florida back. But the problem is when they come back, the Spanish are weak at best. They are really losing their control and their domination throughout the world. There are other skirmishes and other things happening between the wars and things of that nature that are happening back in Europe and around the world that is weakening Spain's position as the dominant and leading country. So what we then find is that migratory patterns begin to now concentrate out west. Now, here's the thing we need to understand. Through these migratory patterns, right, the environment is what is also playing a strong role in terms of how the cultural changes are taking place, right? We have the basic basket weaving technique, but it is we have the basic basket weaving technique, but because of the environment, they're having to use different material. And so as we fast forward, when we get into the fight with the Americas, and that's where we really start seeing the saltwater part of the Underground Railroad fully develop. And so I'll fast forward, because I'm sure I'm talking too long. I just love what I do, good people, so y'all have to work with me. When we fast forward and the fight becomes now not with the British, but with the Americans, who are now dead set on advancing plantation society. And they see these Florida Maroon societies and the Seminoles as a direct threat to the advancement of plantation society. And so as we go into the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see a full all-out onslaught develop between plantation society and their ideas of not only taking the land from the Seminoles, but also getting those blacks back into enslavement. And at this point, they're 3 and 4 and 5 generations free. But according to English law, if your great-great-great-grandfather was enslaved or your great-great-great-great-grandmother was enslaved, that means you still belong to someone. So as far as they were concerned, they were still all, no matter how old, how young, they were still someone's property and considered absconded enslaved people. And so when we get into the early 1800s and the War of 1812 really begins to change the dynamics, when England is pushed out of the Americas, of North America, as a result of the War of 1812. Of course, they still had some possessions in Canada, and the relationship England-Canada continued for many years. But as far as we're talking present-day United States downward into the Caribbean, they are losing possessions, particularly in North America. They're being pushed out present-day United States altogether. And so because of their relationship with the Florida Maroons, who after the first Seminole War, 1816, 1818, the War of 1812 ends around 1816, the first Seminole War, 1816 to 1818. So during that period, 1812 to 1818, and then the ceding of Florida over to the United States in 1819, and the official transfer that takes place in 1821. So between 1812 and 1821, we see major changes develop. First major change is that we stop calling them Florida Maroons, and we now collectively call them Black Seminoles. But as far as the Underground Railroad is concerned, we now understand that when the British leave North America, because of their relationship that they developed with the Florida Maroons and helping them fight against the Americans in the Revolution, as well as more specifically in the War of 1812. That relationship caused Florida Maroons and Black Seminoles at this point now to strengthen and further develop the saltwater portion of the Underground Railroad, in that there were groups of Black Seminoles who left at specific periods of time through their relationship with the British and into the Caribbean in different areas of the British possession. So we now see Gullah people who are now Black Seminoles, but have the roots in Gullah, and Gullah cultural characteristics being transported to Barbados, being transported to Trinidad, and then a higher concentration being transported to the Bahamas. And so this is where we see in the Bahamas, on Andros Island, the Black Seminole population is the strongest. They have the largest community. And that was specifically through their relationship with General Nichols, who was the leading general in the area during the War of 1812. He basically goes into the Caribbean. He buys up large areas of land. He provides a safe haven that is isolated on Andros Island. And through that isolated place, they are able to continue to survive and actually thrive. And so, of course, even if you go to Andros Island today, one of the primary towns, if not the primary town, is called Nicholstown. So we see the saltwater portion of the railroad, Underground Railroad, developing the strongest from that 1820 period, resulting from the War of 1812 to the first Seminole, to the ending of the first Seminole War, and the transfer and the development of Florida now as a U.S. territory, which officially takes place in 1821. Now, of course, they pushed the Native Americans, they pushed Seminole Native Americans, they pushed Black Seminoles out of North Florida, particularly because the area between the Swanee River, which is basically northward, right in the area with Gainesville, a little northward, all the way over to Tallahassee, to the Ochlockonee River, which is about 8 miles west of Tallahassee, and then even further into the Apalachicola area with the Apalachicola River. But that land was considered the most fertile in the region, and that it was even more fertile than some places in Georgia, which was now booming with cotton. So the idea was, of course, to bring the cotton industry into Florida, which they do. After the First Seminole War, they're pushed downward, and then Tallahassee becomes the epicenter of the cotton industry in Florida. So now plantation society has moved from the east into what they now call Middle Florida. Now, as far as the Seminole Nation is concerned, and when they say Seminole Nation, we're talking about Native Americans and Blacks, right? The Tampa area is the only area in which they are able to fully thrive. In the areas where they were pushed directly down from Gainesville present-day Gainesville and down into present-day where I am, which is Orlando, and the neighboring county of Lake County, it was primarily inhabitable. And then on the East Coast, for those small numbers, they were actually pushed further down the St. Johns River, which, of course, again, was actually flowing northward, but they were in a southward pattern direction down, headed down now past St. Augustine, down into the area which we would consider now just east, or southeast, excuse me, west of Daytona. And this is where the last of the St. Johns River tributaries exist. And they, of course, they're still there if you go straight out from Orlando in a northeastern direction toward Daytona. And so these were, though, in that area, at the bottom of those tributaries and pushing them past those tributaries, and then directly down from Gainesville into where I live present day in Orlando, those were inhabitable areas at that time. Food source was sparse, as well as the land itself was swampy, low-lying, and hard to grow and sustain a good agricultural process. And so they returned. They returned to North Florida, and then, of course, when they return to North Florida, they get involved in the Second Seminole War, which was the longest, costliest, and deadliest Native American, quote unquote, Native American war fought. But all the evidence we have, we see in specific periods of time where the Black Seminoles were the primary objective, where Black Seminoles were fighting harder, they were putting up the larger fight, and they became the primary enemy, so to speak. And so, of course, we even have the famous line where General Thomas Jessup, who was in charge of the Florida campaign, says that this is not an Indian war. This is a Negro war. Now, that also, you know, it could be for some people, and like I said, we need much more research, and I'm glad there are people out there that's doing the research. The lines between Black Seminoles and Blacks within the Seminole Nation and Blacks who are part of the original homogenous group's roots need to be researched, because when they say Negro War, we don't know how many of these quote unquote dark-skinned people they saw in these Seminole Native American villages. And we don't know how far their roots went back. So again, further research is needed for that. But at this particular point, until we get all of that and much more, a much better understanding, we are particularly talking about those Black Seminoles from the Florida Maroon roots and Gullah roots. And so in that, of course, in 1838, about halfway through the war, the United States basically gives up in terms of their idea of recapturing all of these Blacks and getting them back into plantation society. And so they do begin to migrate out west to the Arkansas Territory. And of course, the Arkansas Territory is broken up and it develops. And we have, of course, present-day Arkansas, we have present-day Oklahoma, and other areas, but other states rather. But at one time, when they first went out there, all of that was considered the Arkansas Territory. And so from that Arkansas Territory and from present-day Oklahoma, we have and we see, even though there was supposed to be guaranteed freedom to them, that we saw intrusions on that freedom. We saw the dynamics of the relationship with Native Americans changing, in that they were still demanding some of the things that they were getting from Blacks in Florida. They expected that relationship to remain the same, where Blacks were like, no, we don't need to continue that because we're all free now. And then, of course, as Arkansas develops into its own territory and statehood, it develops as a slave state. And so now there's trouble with slave catchers and things of that nature, and enslaved stealers, trying to take Blacks into Arkansas and enslave them. And then there was the last part, which was always a problem, even from the earlier negotiations in the 1820s, when they were first trying to get rid of the Seminoles. And that was the fact that the Creeks were living in such close proximity, and the Creeks still had this relationship with plantation society. So the Creeks were still helping whites advance plantation society, even out west with Arkansas. And so the migratory pattern, and then changes again, and they move to Mexico to get away from those problems and those issues. Now, the thing about it is we see again a diaspora measure now. Now we're looking at Gullah culture, which is now primarily being dominated with Native American culture, but there's the infusion again of a different type of Spanish culture. So again, what we are finding is the roots of Gullah through the Black Seminoles are going through this major diaspora change, but there are certain cultural characteristics that remain intact throughout these different migratory stations, so to speak, in which they are living. And that is primarily the language that has that basic Gullah West African base. And then there's the basket weaving techniques that still seem to stay intact. And when we look actually on the saltwater side, we see those cultural traits being closer to original Gullah culture than even some places in North America where Gullah originates. And it is because they are so isolated, particularly in the Bahamas on Andros Island. They're so isolated that they actually keep those some of those original cultural characteristics intact. So I'm on. I'm sorry, I'm gonna try to wrap it up here. What we're basically saying then is, from a Gullah root and a Gullah perspective, that includes the Native American, a Native American introspect and a Native American addition. We see the Saltwater Underground Railroad keeping, because of its isolated existence, keeping more of the Gullah cultural characteristics, but spreading the Gullah culture through the Caribbean, where we see the Black Seminole and the stronger Black Seminole experience taking those same cultural characteristics, although they go through a much fuller diasporic change. They still take these basic cultural characteristics and spread them westward. And of course, from Mexico, they go back into America, into Texas. And of course, some of those cultural characteristics again are infused with the dynamics of the environment that goes on in Texas as well. So as I always say, we really do have to give the environment and quote unquote Mother Nature a little more credit than we do. And I'll end it with one last thing. One of the ways we, through Dr. Terrence Weeks' archaeological work, one of the ways we were able to understand how strong the African cultural characteristics were going throughout the Florida Maroons and into the culture as it developed into Seminole culture, was through these archaeological things like the pottery. We are able to differentiate in Florida a maroon village from a Native American village through pottery, in that in the Florida Maroon village, we find pottery with triangular shaped punctures at the top of the pottery, which is directly indicative to the potter, quote unquote, potter's marks that are made in West Africa. And also, we look at the outline of the villages. When we see the structures and we're able to, do the sonar and all of that good stuff, the linear structure, meaning the houses, the chikis, are in a linear line. That means that is also a maroon village, because that was what they brought from plantation society, meaning that linear outlook and that linear structured settlement is reflective of the enslaved quarters on a plantation. So we see all of these different things being carried on, and these different cultural characteristics being taken to all of these various places. But again, what we understand is through the saltwater experience, we find cultural characteristics being closer to the original cultural characteristics that were developed, whereas through the migratory patterns of the Black Seminoles through Oklahoma, Nacimiento, and Texas, we see the cultural characteristics still there as a base, but it goes through a much more different pattern in terms of infusion of other cultures. I think I talked enough, didn't I? I'm sorry if I took it a little too far, sister. They're good people, but I love what I do. Are there any questions for me? Hello? Did I lose people?
Looks like Miss Joanne has a question. Let's see.
Hello? Is there a
Hello,
question?
there you are.
I'm looking.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I had the hands up that was clapping.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'm sorry. It was so good. Thank you. I'm going to listen to it again when you put it on YouTube.
Yes, Randy, you will be able to. It'll be on YouTube, and I'll let everybody know once it's up. Am I muted?
Yeah. I just like to say that was powerful. I'm definitely going to listen to it maybe another 2 times. And Sister Wendy, please let me know, because I want to post it on our page, our YouTube channel as well. Yeah, so thank you very much for this.
So, Anthony, can you tell us about the Black Seminole Project? That's also something I put the website on the
Yes.
in the group chat.
Right. So again, what we're in the process of doing is the Black Seminole Project, which is both a documentary called Freedom Seekers, Black Seminoles of the Past and Present, as well as a full feature-length film, Ghost in the Grass, which is based on my book, Florida's Negro War. Now, with the documentary, again, we're following, and I want people to make sure they understand this, because this is something we really need to move forward in the future with. We really need to accept and begin to use and grasp our understanding around the word diaspora. And so what we're doing with the documentary is we're taking it through those three phases, right? We're looking at the Black Seminoles from, excuse me, from a regional perspective. And when we say regional perspective, we're talking about the five major regions that still have strong Black Seminole communities. And of course, that's Florida, Bahamas, Oklahoma, Mexico, and Texas. And so that's the first phase, in that we're going to look at each region and look at it from with a historical perspective of each region. Then the second phase is we look at the cultural characteristics that we find not only in the past, but still in the present between all of the regions, and even the cultural differences that have happened, like I've said, through environment and through changes in time and history. And then the third phase is that we discuss and we give each region the ability to discuss the issues that they are facing today. And so in that, we hope that we help bring Black Seminoles a little closer together and understanding all of each other's experiences and understanding the dynamics of each regional culture, but also understanding the issues that they're facing today. Because we understand that Black Seminoles in Oklahoma and Black Seminoles in Florida may not be facing the same issues, but they can still help each other and understand it, because Florida may have made some advancements in certain areas where Oklahoma can use and look at how they can use and get those same advancements and move themselves forward. And then there are other things, right? Like, and I'll say it quickly, in what we have found is that in the Bahamas and in Mexico, there are two very strong issues that they share. And that is the idea of having dual citizenship. And so we plan to help them and provide that voice for them and make connections so that they can start working on that process. Because even though they do share the same idea for dual citizenship, they share it for two different reasons. But it still comes back to them having this common idea, and that is dual citizenship will help advance their communities. And so even though they have it for two different reasons, one wants to concentrate on the work and jobs and being able to secure jobs, while one is looking for the educational advancements so that it can turn into stronger jobs and stronger ability for them to develop and keep their culture intact. It still comes down to them sharing that experience. Even though they may have it, they still have that same issue. So that's why we say that the third phase in diaspora studies, which is looking at all of the history, looking at all of the cultural characteristics, and things of that nature, and how we use all of that to find solutions for issues that they're facing today. Now, as far as the movie is concerned, again, it's called Ghost in the Grass. It is based on my book, Florida's Negro War. If you haven't gotten it, please get it, because this is the story of the first Underground Railroad developing into the largest and most successful enslaved rebellion in the United States. And it happens in an area where now we are fighting to even get our children to hear and learn about the advancements and the contributions of Blacks in Florida. And so there are two ways that you can get the book. You can go to profaedixon.com and click on books and then get the book that way. Or you can simply go to Amazon, and it is on Amazon. And again, the title is Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. And so support for that gives the overall support for the documentary and support for the film, because we must tell the story of the first Underground Railroad, the longest Underground Railroad, the most successful. Our children, our generations, and America needs to understand that this history is American history. And so again, I urge you all to go to BlackSeminoleProject.com as well. Subscribe, keep up with us. You get updates on how the documentary is going and things of that nature. And the last thing I do want to say about the documentary, we simply want to be a voice and an instrument for the Black Seminole community. And so in that, each region has a representative on the production of the documentary, and they are producers of the documentary. So they have very strong word say so what is going to be said about their region and what is going to be said about their people and culture. And I think this is what is going to really be the strength of this documentary, that the primary voices are Black Seminoles, but not only that the primary voices are Black Seminoles, that even on the production part, they have a very strong say-so as well. So I do thank you for allowing me to come and talk with you all.
Hey, Anthony, there was a question from Randy. He wanted to know if you'd be at Seminole Days this year. So are you planning to return?
Yes, I plan to be at Seminole Days again this year. I'm hoping that you all work this out, because we do need to get to Seminole Days in Oklahoma as well. So I'm hoping that the Texas Seminole days and the Oklahoma Seminole days are not at the exact same time. I'm really hoping you all work that out. But I do plan to be at one because we do need to get some more voices. We need to get some more voices, particularly from Oklahoma. We've gotten some strong voices from Texas, but if there's a possibility of getting some more, we would. And we are definitely on the leg in which we are concentrating on Bahamas and Mexico. These are the two areas that we really need to begin to focus our energy and efforts toward.
Hey, did you see Miko's comment? He has a question
That they
for
were
you.
going to Coastal Carolina?
Yeah. So do you have any books to recommend for a Texas Black Seminole retracing their steps? That's a great question.
Do I have any books? Yes. I'm sorry, I'm so entrenched. Let me think of the name of it. Let me see if it's up there right quick. No, all my Black Seminole work is out front where I can get to it the fastest. Dog it. Email me. Professor A.E. Dixon at gmail.com, and I will give you a full list. I'm sorry, I just can't think of it right off. But just email me, remind me, tell me what you need, and I will get you a full list, which is probably better than me just telling it to you. You'll have something that you will refer back to as well. I will give you a full list. Are there any other questions?
Dr. Dixon?
Yes, sir.
Yes, it's kind of off the subject. Learned a lot tonight. Appreciate your presentation. I have a question regarding your studies and research on Black Seminole cowboys. And of course, back in those days, they didn't call them cowboys; they were cow herders or whatever. And I wonder if you had been involved in that area of research on the Black Seminoles.
In terms of specific research for the Negro Scouts, no. I did a general on the migratory patterns, but looking specifically at the dynamics, no, I am beginning to get into it now as we fully and further develop the documentary. But I certainly haven't written and published any articles or things of that nature on them. No.
Yeah, the story I read many years ago, and I'm trying to find out who wrote it. They talked about the slaves in the lower South being moved westward into Texas, and of course the grasslands of East Texas. And a lot of them escaped and went into Mexico, and they were experts at handling large herds of cattle, and they met up with the vaqueros, who were expert horsemen, and supposedly they taught each other their respective skills, and they became some of the best cowboys in the West after the Civil War. And of course, they rode the cattle trails, and of course, that's something we never read about, we never hear about, and there's a subject that I hope one day will, come forth and explore, get more information on that.
See, because what you're actually discussing is what I'm trying to get. I've been trying to get this brother out in Texas, and this other brother who had spent time in Texas. He's back in California now. What you're actually talking about is the Third Underground Railroad, which went from Louisiana, Texas, and the southern part of Arkansas to
Okay.
Mexico and to across the Gulf to Belize. And see, what people don't know, that is actually how Belize became a primary Black country,
Okay.
through that relationship of the Third Underground Railroad. And to this day, to this very day, Belize does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. And it was based on the fact that it was one of the primary destinations of the Third Underground Railroad.
Okay.
And I'm trying to get, excuse me, I'm going dry on you, brother, but I'm trying to get some professors that I know have done articles and have done some of that research,
Yeah.
to go ahead and put a full piece together,
Yeah.
because we do need to discuss that Third Underground Railroad, because the issue, and I'm just going to call it like it TI is, the issue is the First Underground Railroad and the First Underground Railroad and the Third Underground Railroad were done on Blacks' full volition of their own. And it didn't have this quote unquote idea of the benevolence of whites and things of that nature, that Blacks did this on their own volition. And so the first, which was again, like I said, the longest and most successful, and then the third, which was a very strong railroad in itself, in that it also helped, and that's the thing that they don't talk about as well, it actually helped Mexico toward their development and movement against slavery as well. So I really am trying to get them to do a full piece on it, and not just the different articles that come out. And I want them to do a public history piece instead of just an academia piece. But the public history piece that's rooted in strong research and academia, but written in a way such that the larger public will consume it and want to read it.
Okay.
So I'm with you, brother. I'm trying to get them to do it, because I can't do it all.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I think we need more recognition of people like Blas Payne and some of these other, the Black Seminoles who went into that type of occupation. The cowboys and cowherders. They were contributed greatly to the economy of this country. So, my opinion,
Well,
we need.
it's that overall idea, right? The understanding that this Black history is American history, and how strong the footprint is,
right,
and how large these contributions are.
Right, exactly. Okay, well, I won't hold you any longer. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
All right. Thank you for the question. Good one, though.
Are there any other questions from anybody? I think I have a bit of a question. In listening to you talk, it seems like all of these relationships were formed under great duress, yet it seemed to bring out these exemplary characteristics of both groups. And in thinking about that, it's hard to speculate, like, what would have happened if none of this had happened? Would these groups have just naturally met if they didn't have to come together to fight at some point? So I guess my question is, if there had been no wars, if there had been no need to migrate, how would these groups have probably met up in Florida? Or would that just have never have happened because they would have never really had to migrate towards each other?
That's an interesting question. And I would say it takes both, right? Because people are naturally migrators anyway, right? And as populations and settlements grows, especially from the 17th to the 19th century, right? Water sources were always in demand and needed. So as a community lived on, let's say, the one of the primary tributaries of the St. John's, I'm just using an example here, of the St. John's River, right? That community would have gotten to a point where members of that community would have migrated somewhere else because the community itself needed a stronger water source, right? So I think migratory patterns would take place regardless, right?
If it was under duress from a potential war under attack.
Right. The potential war and under attack is that stronger element. But people, particularly during that time, are migratory anyway, right? And let's look at that. I'm gonna use this as an example in Florida, and I'm sure you can see it in Texas and in Oklahoma as well, right? Even when they were, for that period of time, living in Central Florida, right? And the larger white community was more concerned with North Florida than Central Florida. And then of course they did become concerned with it and of course caused those patterns again with war and whatnot. But even when they weren't, Black Seminoles and the Seminole Nation were moving throughout Central Florida because the water sources and the food sources were causing them to do such, right? That they migrated out of the Tampa area. They were forced down from the Gainesville area, but when they got into those areas, it caused them to go either further west toward Tampa, toward the coast, or they went further east toward Lake Okeechobee in that area, which was a very large, and is rather, a very large water source, which of course brought more animals and food sources. So I say that to say the wars and the constant trouble in terms of conflict with whites was, of course, the strongest factor. But even when there were times where they weren't being accosted and harassed by plantation society, they were still in migratory patterns looking for better water and food sources. So
yeah, you know, Dr. Dixon, that I think there's even a subtle third leg to that amongst the diasporas, you know, the internal and external pressures amongst all these different groups in the diaspora, amongst the different tribes, the blacks, and so on and so forth, these subgroups. So I think that's even like a third part of that triad, the environmental, as you were saying, the plantation, the white society, and then the internal strife and external strife against those forces too would probably play a part.
Yes, I agree. Definitely, because everyone didn't just automatically accept the intermingling, you know, between the Maroons and between it, right? Then you have to also remember that these were homogenized groups, right? So there could be this band of Yuchi that may now belong to the Seminoles, right? They may belong to the Seminoles, but they still kind of look at that band, that band of Miccosukee over there, who they've been fighting with for years, right? So even though, well, Miccosukee is a bad one because Miccosukee didn't go into the Seminoles, but let me think of another smaller band. There are smaller bands of Cherokee, right? There were small bands of Cherokee that belonged to the Yamasee Federation and, of course, go into Seminole. So let's say that a small band of Cherokee who had been fighting with this band of Yuchi, right, for years around, let's say, Lake Okefenokee, right? And now they're in the Florida together within the Seminoles, but they still may have this side eye, right? So
Dr.
they
Dixon,
may
if
be
I could
Seminoles,
interject,
but we gonna go here, y'all go over there, you know?
Dr. Dixon, if I could interject a little bit, just I think you made a slight error. It's actually Lake Okeechobee, not Okefenokee.
No,
And I don't
no,
want to
I was
digress.
saying Okefenokee is on the Georgia-Florida line in terms of where they would have began when they started their
Yes,
first
sir.
migratory patterns. And
Yes, sir.
then
My
I was
mistake.
saying from Central Florida over to Lake Okeechobee, in terms of looking for food sources.
Yes. And I've always personally had a problem with saying, and our friends in Oklahoma can certainly correct me if I'm wrong. I know that when the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma were making that big to do, they say we want to go as what the nation was in 1823. I've always said there was no Seminole Nation in 1823 based on what you're just saying, because a lot of these groups were just a loose alliance at that point. You still had those distinctions, like you said, like the Yuchi may look at some of the Miccosukes, who may look at some of the Alachues, et cetera, et cetera. So there was that loose alliance, but there was no formal nation, if you will. And we sometimes see that erupting into violence. Now, I'm definitely going to leave alone right now the whole thing between Seminole and Miccosukes. I've had that argument with some of our relatives on a regular basis. That's a whole other discussion. But that's just a term I've always felt very uncomfortable with. And also, even the U.S. Army, up until the time of the Second War, we're still identifying many of the different groups by their town names. There was the term Seminole, but you will find in most of the records they were specifically identified by town. So that whole thing about a Seminole nation being in a formal sense, I think really is just a myth, in my humble opinion. Excuse me.
Well, how about this? Maybe how about this? What we have been trained to do, and I mean everyone psychologically, right, is that when the larger white community plants a name on something and they begin to accept it as something, we simply coalesce and go with it. So you're right, like I said, by 1750s, even the English, the Spanish, all of them were using some vernacular of the word Seminole, right? Right. But that does not necessarily mean that within those groups they were accepting that within themselves, right?
Yes, sir.
That they were just collectively. It's sort of like the same idea, right? That we've had to break away and get away from the fact that it's not until larger white society recognizes something that we say it is, right? So it's the other way around, right? Just because larger white society has said this is what it is, doesn't necessarily mean that that was what it was within their own dynamics.
Yes, sir. You're preaching to the converted here. Thank you.
Any other questions from anybody?
No, I just want to ask Dr. Dixon, did I meet you at last year's Seminoles Days? Were you there?
In Brackenville?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we were at the last one. We were doing some filming.
Yeah, remember you made that special phone call when I was with you. I was with my Buffalo Soldier brothers. Who'd you call that day? You remember?
Yes.
That's me.
I called R2 for him. I called R2 Crumley, one of his people that was under him when he was at FAMU.
Yeah, but who was that special Hollywood guy you called?
Oh, we called Louis Gossett Jr.
There you go. I remember that. Yeah, we met. Thought that was you.
Yes.
Good to see you again, brother.
Louis Gossett Jr. is a producer of both the documentary and film.
Yeah, no, we had a nice heated, not heated, but a great discussion about all of that. I'm just so excited about what you're doing. You're still carrying that torch. You know what I mean? I'm on top of it. I love it.
Oh yeah, we're still plugging away. Let's call it like it is. What we're doing is we're working on, as far as the documentary is concerned, we're working on that last bit of funding that we need to get to the Bahamas and get to Mexico. And that's where we are.
Now, I have a question. Is there a visual, because you talk about the different underground railroads, the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. Is there a visual of that depicts the groups and as they migrated through, because I didn't even know about the Belize. And I grew up in New York. I had a family of folks from Belize that were my neighbors, But is there a graphical that explains and shows those groups and their movement in each one of those railroad lines that you've been talking about? Or is that something we'll be waiting for?
That's the thing, right? In academia, we've had some articles published, and we've had those types of discussions at different conferences. But that's what I was saying. I'm trying to get them to put it all together and put it in a public history form, where, because we've long since gotten to the point where academia writes for academia,
Right, understood.
And so we got to get out of that. And that was one of the reasons I wrote Florida's Negro War. I wrote it as a public history piece, not as an academia piece. As a matter of fact, I only did one refereed article on it. Everything else has gone out into public consumption through, blurbs, things of that nature, social media stuff, and of course the public history book. I only did one academic article on it.
Yeah, it's easier to digest, as you're saying, for the basic reader. Yep,
right.
Understood.
Sometimes you do just have to cut the fat and give the meat,
Get right to the meat. Hey, thank you, Doctor. I appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
Well, Dr. Dixon, I want to say thank you for an amazing evening. I felt like I was sitting in a lecture class. Like you said, you love to talk, but I think we enjoyed listening. So just can't thank you enough. There was a lot of information to take in. So like I said, it's being recorded, and I'll let everybody know once it's up on YouTube so that we can go back and listen over and over again. Like Ezekiel said, I think it needs to be listened to a couple of times to get all the info that you gave us this evening. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who is on this Zoom call.
Thank you, Wendy.
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you for spending time with us.
Yeah,
no, this is fun. Yeah, this is fun.
Always.
Thanks, Wendy.
Appreciate everybody coming out. Yeah.
Good night.
Thank you for having me. I thoroughly enjoy what I do. And I believe this is my purpose in life, doing these African diaspora studies. And I thank you for giving me another platform to share what I have learned and the information that I have come across.
Yeah, well, you can definitely tell. Yeah. Yeah, you can tell that this is your passion. So thank you.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Thank you, Wendy.
Oh, no, thank you. Like I said, I'm so happy that everybody's on here. Can't thank y'all enough for spending time with us on this Wednesday evening. So, thank y'all for just coming on and listening. So
God bless.
That, yeah, just want to say good evening to everybody. And, we'll let you know about the next Zoom pretty soon. We're trying to shoot for every third Wednesday of the month around that time, just so you kind of have an idea of when the next one will be.
Okay. Good night.
Good night,
Good night,
y'all.
everybody.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you.